Hey CRMers, Benita's here. Today I'm going to be talking about entity relationship diagrams in the context of Microsoft Dynamics CRM. So I use entity relationship diagrams in every project that I have been in. I find it very useful when you are trying to put together your thoughts on what entities are going to be built, and it just helps you and your developers to understand what we are building towards the client requirements. And I find that it is very useful when it comes to the point where you need to do handover from the project team to the support team, which is usually in managed services, because it helps those consultants understand what it is that we have built and how the solution has come together. So how this came about is that last year I went traveling around Europe. I absolutely loved it. I had such a blast. I saw amazing places with its own buildings, its history, its sculptures, its food. So I've put together some of my favorite photos from this trip. So in front of you, you can see Barcelona. So these are Gaudi's beautiful artifacts that his designs that are still around today. So over on the left, that was inside the La Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. It was amazing. And then over on the right is Lyon. So I went to Lyon as well. And there's a Notre Dame in Paris over on the left, and the Duomo in Florence. Oh my goodness, just seeing these photos makes me want to go back. And then we've got the Duomo in Milan. And then we have beautiful Rome. I loved Rome. Rome is amazing. You should definitely go if you haven't been. And of course, near the Colosseum is the Palatine Hill. So when you're looking at all of these magnificent buildings, these sculptures, you can tell that a lot of planning went behind the design. You know, it wasn't built in a day, as I say. Rome wasn't built in a day. And it's definitely true in the nature of CRM. You can't just, well, I suppose you can't create an extended version of CRM in a day. You know, there's lots of planning that goes behind it. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, which is entity relationship diagrams. So what is an entity relationship diagram? It's also known as entity relationship modeling. So basically, it's a breakdown of the entities, the attributes, and the relationships of tables in a database. And it's also how it's going to be viewed by the end user. And typically, an ERD, it's used when you are designing so that you can identify the different elements and how they all relate to each other. So why do we use ERDs? It allows you to portray your thoughts in terms of what you will be building. So am I doing this right? Am I taking the right approach? And before you build, you can outline your elements all together in a Visio diagram, or there are some other tools. I use Visio because it just comes with the Office suite at my work. But it also makes you think about, should I approach this design differently? Is there anything that I should be doing different in terms of these relationships? Should I have it as a native many-to-many, or should I put in a manual intersect entities? I'll come to that later on in this session. And most of all, what you need to keep in mind when you are designing for a CRM solution is you need to recognize that whatever you're building fits within the project budget. So if you have like a 50K project, you need to make sure that you're within that boundary. So make sure you are, because if you're over it, it's not going to be a good ending. I also believe it helps developers understand the solution. When you put an ERD in front of them, they're able to quickly work out what the relationship is between the entities. So it makes them think about, okay, how should I write this plugin? Because this plugin is not only going to impact this entity that I'm calling, but I have to make sure that it's not going to impact the entities that this primary entity that I'm building for in terms of its relationships with the other entities. Does that make sense? I don't know. Sorry. Also, it's pretty good in terms of understanding where in your solution you're going to have integration points. So examples are CRM can be hooked into a payment gateway. So are you going to have your payment gateway talk to the invoice record in CRM, or are you going to create a custom entity, such as, let's say, a transaction entity that the payment gateway is going to communicate with, and then from the back of that transaction, let's say when it is approved, it's going to go ahead and flow through into the invoice and the order to update the invoice to paid and the order to fulfilled. So it also helps understand how you can integrate external systems and what are the touch points of it in your solution. Okay, so how's this applied in CRM? So in CRM, because it is a database, your entities that you create are the tables. So these are record types such as your order and invoice, or the custom entity of transaction that I mentioned before. And then you've got your attributes, which are the different field types in CRM. So this could be an option set, a 2-option, multiple lines of text. And then we have relationships. So there are 3 relationships in CRM, which I will get to later on in this session. So there are many different types of entity relationship models. The one that I apply when I do my ERDs is the crow's foot. That's a personal preference because I find that it is very easy to understand, and I had a good teacher back then, Sean. So Sean, if you're watching, I hope you're proud of me trying to explain this to my CRM followers. Cool. All right, so for the rest of the session, I'm going to be explaining the crow's foot entity relationship model. Okay, and then in terms of your entity relationship model, for crow's foot, there is this, I'm going to say thing because I don't know how else to describe it. There's this thing called cardinality and ordinality, which essentially means, what is the maximum and minimum relationship from one entity to another. So up on the screen, I've got 6 types of them displayed. You've got one and only one, 0, 1, one or many, 0, many. So I would say the last 4 in that list are relationships that maybe someone might not know if they don't have an advanced knowledge of ERD, but the first 2, one and many, that is at a basic level of ERD. So I will be explaining how these cardinality and ordinality works in terms of ERDs for CRM. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 types of relationships that exist in CRM when you are doing customizations. So the first one is one-to-many. So an account can have many contacts, a case can have many entitlements, an opportunity can have many quotes. The second type of relationship that exists is a many-to-one. So here are some examples, and opportunities is associated to one account or contact. You have an invoice that can only be associated to one order, and the same applies for a prices item where it needs to be associated to one prices. So all of these relationships that I'm listing right now for these entities, these are the standard ones that come out of the box in CRM. And then we have finally the many-to-many native relationship that exists in CRM. So here are some many-to-many relationships from out of the box records. So a marketing list, it can be associated to many campaigns. You have a contact that can be associated to many marketing lists, and you have a product that can be associated to many leads. Okay, so here's the fun part in terms of modeling in the context of CRM. So if you think about it, a lookup field is a many-to-one as it is a relationship from one record to another. And if it is mandatory, then the cardinality and ordinality of it in one side, so the notation on one side of the relationship is one and only one. So this is an example. A priceless lookup field on the priceless item is mandatory, so it is a one and only one notation. And if it isn't mandatory, then it is a 0 or 1 notation on one side of the relationship. So it will look like this. So an example is the order lookup field on the invoice. It is not mandatory. So this means that an invoice can exist without being associated to an order. Then in terms of a subgrid, it's always going to be a 0 or many notation, and that's because your subgrid only comes into effect after you save the record. So if you create a brand new record and there is a subgrid displayed in the entity form of that record, usually you'll see that to enable the subgrid, please save the record, which means in order to add a record to that subgrid, you need to save the record first. So out of the box, it's always going to be a 0 or many notation. Okay, so let me show you how this is going to work. You guys ready? Hope you are. Okay, so here's something that I've put together that hopefully you can understand and learn with me. So this is just an example of like a business case, I suppose. So I'm going to be designing for a property management company called Zone Property, and they had a recent incident that made their office go up in flames, and they want to go into the cloud to prevent this from happening again in case someone decides to light the office on fire, because you know what, that can happen. There is a Milton in every organization. So if you don't know who Milton is, maybe you need to check out Office Space. Office Space, is that the film? Anyways, okay, so here are the business requirements. So usually when you are working with a client, you get a list of business requirements and you are responsible for understanding them, fleshing them out, trying to find out what are the rules behind the requirements. So here's a list of requirements. So store information of tenants, landlords, and owners, visibility of properties managed by Zone Properties, 8 offices in Green Bay. They want to store tenancy agreements. They want to be able to record property inspections and create segmented lists for targeted communications. Okay, so what I tend to do is when you understand the business requirements, you do an assessment. So what is solution design versus what is standard functionality in the CRM? Now, this can change during the life cycle of the project once you work with the customer, but usually when I see something like a segmented list for targeted communications, for me, I feel like that is something that can be achieved using advanced finds that you can use in marketing lists. So this is one that I don't think is necessarily related to solution design until we've actually built the fields for the entities that will be used in that advanced find. So, but for the other requirements, that's where I'm like, yep, cool. This is requirements that have to do with extending CRM. Okay, so typically the next bit is you go through a user story exercise, and this is if your project is using the Agile methodology. So a lot of the projects that we do here at Myriad IT use this framework, so we do go through user story exercises. So now the next task is putting them into a user story list and understanding what these different user stories are. So in front of you, there are things like property managers needing to know the history of tenancy agreements for a property so that they can contact previous tenants if required. There's things as wanting to schedule property inspections. So usually if people are renting property, Some property management companies, it is mandatory for them to do routine inspections, and that's what needs to be captured in CRM. And then there are things like knowing who the tenants are of a tenancy agreement, so that the property manager knows who the current tenants are, and things like the period of a tenancy agreement. Okay, so then after you've got your user stories, the next bit that you need to do, see, I told you this thing wasn't, it's not, there's lots of planning behind it, so it doesn't end just with the user stories. Anyways, back to it. So you have to work out what your elements are from your user story. So what is it that we're building after we know what these user stories are? And once you get a feel of the different elements, you're then able to list them out. So in front of you, I've listed tenancy agreements, tenants. We need to capture property inspections. We need to know who the property manager is, the landlord, the owner, and the period of tenancy agreement. So then you have to go through the process of identifying what are the entities and what are the fields. Sometimes you don't know them straight away, so it is perfectly normal to come back to it at a later point in time. So for example, with the tenancy agreement, not really sure, maybe it's something that we need to talk about with the client, which is fine, but for everything else, you may have an indication of what fields need to be captured, especially if you're working closely with the client and they are approving your user stories and the narrative behind those user stories as you go. Okay, so once you have all of that information where you understand what the business requirements are, you understand what are the end user stories and the narratives behind the end user stories are, and you have a rough indication of what those elements are, now we can get to the awesome bit of solution design, and that is when we are applying the entity relationship diagram. So this is the most exciting part of this blog session, so come with me right now. Okay, so the first step in understanding entity relationship diagrams is what is the maximum cardinality? What is the maximum rule? So taking the element of property and inspection, so we know that these are two records that don't exist in CRM, so they need to be custom entities. So the trick that Sean had taught me was first lay them out. So you have property and you have an inspection custom entity. So a property can have many, yes, if you said many, then yes, you're correct, can have many inspections, okay? So then number two is doing the opposite. So thinking about the inspection relationship to the property. Okay, so here we have the inspection, we have the property. And so an inspection must always, an inspection can only be associated to a single, so if you said single, that's fine, to one property. So this is what it's going to look like. Okay, so then the next step in relationship diagrams is you need to think about the minimum rule. So again, the property, we bring up the property and we bring up the inspection. So if you think about it, a property needs to have at least one inspection. But when you think about it, going back to my earlier slide, a subgrid is going to always be a zero or many notation because of how, in order for the subgrid to work, it needs to, oh, sorry, I just explained this wrong. Okay. So the inspection is always going to be a zero or many notation because of how that maximum cardinality is a many notation. So when you think about it, the only type of relationship that we have in CRM two types of relationships that we have in CRM that end with a many notation is a one-to-many with a many-to-many. And in both scenarios, it's always going to be a zero or many notation because of how you cannot make the many notation of the relationship mandatory. So that is why we have a zero or many. So this is what it's going to look like. So when you put that all together, sorry, I forgot the other way around. So the next bit is we have the inspection to the property. So an inspection must always be associated to one property. So in terms of the full relationship, property can have many inspections. An inspection can be associated to one property, and on the minimum level, a property must have at least one inspection, but again, because it is a many notation at the end of a relationship, it needs to be zero or many. And on the other side of the spectrum, an inspection must always be associated to one property. An inspection cannot exist without a property. So that is it in terms of how we apply relationship diagrams. I think I screwed up the previous slides a little bit, but I'm just going to keep going. I won't pause. Okay, so in terms of your ERD, this is what it would look like, possibly if you have a many-to-many. Now, these ERDs that I'm showing you right now is just based from my personal thoughts. It can be different based on how you design, and that's the beauty of ERD. Okay, so back to it. In terms of native many-to-many, it's the many-to-many relationship that you create within the solution of CRM. So this isn't a bad design. However, it will have limitations in the long term if you want to do things like reporting or to be able to search effectively for these records. So for example, if I want to search properties associated to a contact where we are using the native many-to-many, it may be a bit hard. Sorry, one sec. And that's because for those of you who are familiar with Advanced Find, you would know this, where it can get a bit tricky because Advanced Find, while you can do many-to-many Advanced Find searches, and that's when you, in your custom relationship, there's, is that a checkbox or a drop down that allows you to search? Can't remember, but I'll show you. It can be difficult to get the results that you want. So in terms of breaking apart those many-to-many relationships, you can build manual intersect entities, which can make it easier. So for example, I've gotten rid of the many-to-many relationship between the contact and the property. I've built a custom entity in between called property contacts, and the same with the contact to tenancy agreement relationship. I've inserted a custom manual intersect entity in there, and the same with property manager. Okay, and then last of all, in terms of the ERD, typically what I do is I ensure that I give a legend just so that it's easy to understand what is a custom entity and what is an out-of-the-box entity. And this allows developers and anyone else in your project team to understand which are custom entities and which are out of the box. And the same applies to the client. When you show this to them, they understand that they are going to be getting a solution that is going to be an extended version of the out-of-the-box CRM. Okay, so then the other fun bit is creating those field attributes for your entities. So what I have highlighted in orange is the customizations that I'm going to build in front of you, and what I have highlighted in red is the fields that we're going to create, as well as the relationships that we have all together. So in terms of the contact, the tenant, the tenancy agreement the property and the property manager custom entities. Those I have built, so I'm going to show you property contents and inspections right now. Okay, so I'm going to go into my CRM instance and we're going to go ahead and go to the solution. So what we're doing today is the property contact and the inspection. Okay, so I have created the custom entity and now I'm going to create the fields. Okay, so if we just go back to my slide and we go back to the ERD, so we have the relationship of the contact to property contacts and the property contacts to property. Because the notation at this side of the relationship is one and only one, it means that I need to create a lookup where it is mandatory. So if I go back to this slide, here it is. So here are my two lookups that I'm going to create, and notice that I have that many to one relationship, but the cardinality is that it is going to be a one and only one relationship. Okay, so if I change this to custom and I click new, we're going to go ahead and create our first lookup, which is to the property custom entity. Okay, so I'm going to select my lookup and we are going to select the property entity. And there it is right here. And again, because it is a 0 or 1 notation, we are going to use business required. So I'm going to click Save and New because I want to create my contact lookup. Okay, so I'm going to create my contact one now. And again, because it's a many to one, it's going to be a lookup as per my ERD. And then while that's creating, our next field is type. So this is when I'm just gonna create a option set where the values will be landlord and owner. Cool. Okay, so the next bit that we need to do is add the fields that we created onto the form. So I can show you what it's like. So we have contact, the property, and the type of property contact that they are. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to create is the inspection. This is the one that we want to do. So in this scenario, again, we've got a couple of lookups here. We've got a lookup to the property entity, and then we have a lookup to the property manager entity that inspected by. Okay, so going down to my inspection entity for us to create the fields. So as I said, we need to create two lookup fields. The first one is towards the property, and that's because if we go back to my slide shortly, an inspection cannot exist without a property. It must always be associated to a property. Okay, So let's find that property record again. Here we go. So then the second lookup that we're going to create is a relationship towards the property manager. So the person from the property management company that is going to do the routine inspection. And this is again business required because an inspection cannot exist without a property manager, so it must always have a property manager. So if we find that, cool. And then we have two new fields that we need to create. One is the schedule date, and then the other one will be whether the reminder has been sent. So let's do that next. Okay, so here we go. So we have schedule date. So we use date and time. Now these are typically just normal field attributes, so they're not going to be a lookup field. So for this one, I'm using a date and time. And then in terms of the reminder sent, I'm simply just going to use a Boolean field. So our field type would be a to option. Cool. And so like what we did before with the property contact custom entity, after our fields have been created, we then add them to a form. So that's what we'll do next. Okay, so we have the property, the scheduled date, and who it's going to be inspected by. Oh, in hindsight, I probably should have made the scheduled date a mandatory field, but that's all right. We can go back later and do it. Okay, so what I have done is I've created lookup fields against both of the custom entities, and because I've created lookup fields, I have now established this relationship. So the many-to-one relationship from the property contact is established through a lookup so that it has relationship to the contact and the property. Okay, so then the next bit that I'm going to show you is the zero or many notation side of the relationship and how that's used. So this is going to be portrayed in the form of a subgrid in CRM. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm first going to change my view just so that it's a bit clearer to the end user. So I'm just going to add the column of the contact, the property, and the type. And what I'll do is I'll move create on to the end, and I want to show most recent at the top and just get rid of name. Cool, so I'll save and close. So while that's being saved, if I go back here, what we're going to do is create the subgrid from the contact to the property contacts. So if I go back to the ERD, it's a one and only one notation where the other side of the relationship is a zero or many, which is the subgrid. So we'll go ahead and do that now. So going into the contact, I'm going to open up the contact main form, and we're going to go ahead and insert that subgrid. So in the entity form, I created a section earlier before this, and this is where I'm going to insert my property contact subgrid. So we want only related records. So we only want to see property contacts for this particular contact record. We don't want to see all property contacts. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select this entity, and this entity exists because of the lookup field that we created in the property contact custom entity. And if I hit set, it's going to be in there. So we hit save and close. And then the other entity that we want to update that will show the property contacts is the property itself. So we're going to open up the main form of the property. So if I go back in here, here's our property entity. So we've already created the lookup from the property contact to the property. That is what this one and only one notation is, and it's a one and only one notation because of how we made that lookup mandatory. Otherwise, if it wasn't mandatory, then it would be a 0 or 1 notation. So the bit that we're going to do now is a subgrid as well. So if I go into the property, here's my property contact, and if I insert the subgrid, again, we should be able to see the relationship because of how we already created that lookup field. Okay, so if we scroll, oops, sorry, I selected the wrong one. So then here's the property contacts, and if I click set, that's it done. And then the last one that we're going to create is the property inspection. So if I go ahead and add the subgrid in here, there it is, and I hit set, it will now show. So I go save. So that one is from this relationship here. So this is one that we created earlier, where in the inspection record we have a mandatory lookup field to the property, which is the one and only one notation. And so from the property, we can view the property inspections, and that's using the subgrid. So that is the 0 or many notation of the relationship. So hopefully you're now understanding how all of this fits together in the context of CRM. So your 0 or many notation is the subgrid, whereas your one and only one notation of the relationship is your mandatory lookup fields. Okay, so if I go save and close. Now before we hit publish, I think I'm just going to edit the inspections. Oops, I spelled that wrong, my bad. Inspections view. So we're going to go ahead and add inspected by property reminder sent and the schedule date. So let me get rid of that. Put this at the end, and I'll sort it by descending. Cool. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and publish our customizations. So while that's going to publish, let me go back to my slide just for a recap. So what we first did was we created the field attributes in these two entities, where the fields that we created were lookup fields, and we made those lookup fields mandatory, and that's because of how the notation is a one and only one notation, which indicates that it needs to be a mandatory field from our ERD. And then from there, because we created the many-to-one lookup field, by default, you can create a subgrid within the entity that it has a relationship to. So in this example, we created a subgrid for the property context in the contact entity, and then we created a couple of contacts in the property entity because it has a relationship back to the inspection and the property contact. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh my CRM instance. So this is an online instance, in case you're wondering why it's green and I have this lovely logo that I had made. Okay, so let's go into our property management area of CRM. So as you can see, we have added these. So these are the custom entities that we created where we've added the fields. And if we open up property contacts and we hit new, we should see those 3 fields that we created. So I'm just going to give this a name. So normally if I am creating a custom entity and there is the name field, I will usually have a real-time workflow that sets the name. But because this is just a demo that I'm showing you, I'm just going to type a name in here. So I'll call this, I don't know if I have any properties. Oh, yes, we do. So we have some sample data in here. So I'm just going to call this property A contact, and I'm going to make this person the landlord. And we can go ahead and create a new one as well. Just call this contact 2. Sorry, excuse my naming convention. And we'll use the second person and we'll select owner. Cool. And we save and close. Cool, so that's gone ahead and created the record. So again, here is my Manytomany lookup fields. It's mandatory, so if I go back to the ERD, it is a one and only one notation. So let's go and create an inspection record as well. I spelled it wrong, so sorry about that. Okay, so if I call this inspection, let's give it a scheduled date of, let's say the 1st of September. We select that property as well. And this is the users that you have in your CRM because of how this lookup is to the property manager the property manager custom entity. In terms of reminder set, we can leave that as no. Cool. All right, so now that we've created a couple of records, we can go ahead and check out our subgrids. So if I go to contacts and we open up the first one, we will be able to see who this person is a property contact for, as you can see. So this is the subgrid that we had added. So as you can see, it's pulling the details through. And then if we were to go into the property record itself, we're going to see the 2 subgrids that we created. So the first one that we did was property contacts over here. So now we have a list of our contacts and the types of property contacts they are for this property. We also have the property inspection record that has been created. So over time, this will have many property inspections listed, but for now, there's only one record in there because I'm just showing you how ERDs work in the context of CRM. So again, in terms of the other subgrids that we have property managers. So let me just go ahead and click new so that you can understand what this one is. So if I go back to the ERD, so previously, if it was a many-to-many, we would see this as a native many-to-many relationship. But because I went ahead and inserted manual intersect entities, I created this custom entity called property manager, which has a relationship to the user. So this guy sits in between the property and user. So So this is what it is showing it here. So as you can see, it's got a lookup to the user records and it's got a relationship back to the property. Same concept for the tenancy agreements. Actually, no, it's just a many-to-one relationship. Here we go. So with a property, it can have many tenancy agreements, and in terms of the tenancy agreement, it can have one property, but it must always be associated back to one property. So we will see this as a mandatory lookup field, which we do in here. So that's pretty much it in terms of ERDs. Hopefully you have a good understanding of entity relationship diagrams now in the context of CRM. So if I go back to my slide, I just want to remind you that if you have a lookup field, it is always going to be this type of notation because, a mandatory lookup field, it is always going to be a one and only one notation. Your subgrid is going to always be a zero or many notation. And in terms of lookup fields that are not mandatory, it's going to be a 0 or 1 notation in the relationship. Okay, well, I already went through that with you in CRM, so I'll skip that slide. So in terms of your ERDs, it will help you design for CRM, and if you can design it in a way where it is scalable, using an ERD can help you with that. So I'm going to give you a bit of a history lesson. So with Coliseum, it has actually been redesigned a couple of times for its purpose. So it actually has gone through different types of formations, but because of how it was built, they were able to, break down some of the areas of the Colosseum and put something else in. Okay, that was a terrible history lesson because I didn't really go into the specifics, but the moral of the story is when you are designing CRM, there's so much planning that needs to be done behind it before you build. And like the expression, Rome wasn't built in a day, it is true for CRM. After you understand what the business requirements are, and after you list them through the form of user stories with the narratives behind them, and after you identify all of your elements that you think you will be building for extending CRM in order to deliver that solution to the customer, you can then also go one step further by putting together an ERD. So that will help you identify all those elements that you do need in order to meet those user stories and how those elements are going to be related to each other and what are the fields that come with those relationships in terms of your mandatory lookup field or your not mandatory field, and whether you're going to be displaying subgrids on your entity form. So that's it in terms of today. I hope you learned something from me today, and I hope I made sense. I feel like it didn't make sense in some of the slides, but hey, it's all good. Until next time, see you guys. Bye.